I am not particularly intelligent. Seriously. In school, my grades were average. Despite the fact that I spent a lot of time studying and practicing for tests. It wasn't that my parents weren't supportive. They were. They're teachers. But when all the effort I put into school yielded only mediocre results, I concluded that I simply wasn't smart enough. Maybe life isn't that fair, I thought. But then one day, I was sitting in history class, and we had just gotten back a history test. And I was looking over at my neighbor, who had gotten an A. He was a top student. I wasn't. And I told him that I wish I was as smart as you. He looked back at me and said, I don't really think I'm that smart. Well, then how do you do it? I asked. I don't know, he said, but my mom always quizzes me on the details, and I find it very helpful. Huh. I had never thought of that. Now, of course, I know that quizzing yourself is a much more powerful way to learn than simply rereading. But back then, I had no idea. Back then, I hadn't even considered the possibility that there might be more than one way to read, more than one way to take notes. I just thought studying was studying. To get ahead, you're either naturally more intelligent, or you simply spent more time than everyone else. But now, I was challenged to consider that perhaps what matters is how you study and how you spend your time. And even my brain could appreciate that how I spend my time was up to me. How you spend your time is up to you. I didn't have to be smart to spend my time in a smart way. So I asked myself this question: how can I learn more effectively?
And that is precisely what we've been looking at this week with the readings and learning revisited. How can we learn more effectively? So we've started to enter into our fourth week. And as we start to move into the next topic, I'd really like to stop for a moment. Before we get there, a couple of housekeeping points. As ever, if you could kindly put your videos on, especially when we go into the breakout rooms, keep yourself on mute, that just helps the flow of things. Use the chat box to ask any questions, and also take the opportunity to share experiences and reflections. If you'd like to ask a question at any point or react, there are the reactions at the bottom. Housekeeping done. We've been looking at learning revisited. And as I said, I really wanted to take the moment in this workshop today to pause on this topic and particularly focus on this term, revisited. And our way into revisiting the learning is to think of the neuromyth. And an entrance into the neuromyth is the work of Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa. Tokuhama Espinosa works for the Harvard Extension School, and she delivers courses on the neuroscience of learning. She's also an author of this superbook, Neuromyths, Debunking False Ideas About the Brain, which talks through and gives all the background to decades of research on the neuromyth. And she introduces the neuromyth by first of all focusing on the myth, which is what I'd love for us to start out with. And she defines the myth as this. A myth is an elaborate tale that prods the imagination. All cultures use stories to explain complex phenomena, to explain things we experience but don't understand. Before we go to the neuromyth proper, I thought what we could do is to break the ice, as it were, and share some myths from our own cultures. So if I could encourage you to head to this WooClap link and spend a few minutes to think about an example of a prominent myth in your culture, and consider particularly what phenomenon the story seeks to explain. So here you could be thinking about myths around natural phenomena, storms, rains. It could be about historical figures. It could be about traditions or rituals or festivities. I've got one up my sleeve, but it did take me a few minutes to think about it. If you head to this link, the WooClap link, we'll post it in the chat as well and give you the opportunity to share a myth in your part of the world. As we're awaiting any additional sharing, I'd love to run through a couple that we've got up here. So the first one I've got over here is that when your middle hand itches, you get money. I wish only that were true. Do pop in the chat anyone who shared that one. Thank you. It'd be super to know what region that one's linked to. I've got another one here that there are myths about dreams. One is that if you dream about, I think we've just lost the end, but I hope it's good fortune if you dream about certain things. There's a myth about sweeping the house. We've got myths about the Papa Bois, the father protector of the forest trees. So we've got a real range here. What's really interesting about the ones that have been shared already is that they're indicative of what's around us every single day. So particularly the Papa Bois is one that really struck me as something that's looking at phenomena around us and also seeking sometimes to protect that phenomena. I should also give my example. So I was thinking about myths linked to England in particular, and a very complicated and complexly woven myth is the one about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, King Arthur having pulled this sword out of a stone and then being crowned king. And that being an example of a myth that seeks to tell the origins of a national identity. And I'm sure many of us have examples of those. So in essence, we're talking about myths that are around us every day and stories that are very compelling. So let's now think about the neuromyth within this context. Back to Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa, again, apologies for the typo I've just spotted there. So she talks about the neuromyth and defines it as this: false beliefs about the brain and or its functioning. So taking that idea of the myth as false ideas and then focusing on the neuro aspect, that is the cells, the nervous system that make up the brain. And she talks about the settings of neuromyths. And she says this: neuromyths are sometimes based on fiction, misunderstandings, misbeliefs, misconceptions, or misinterpretations about how the brain learns. And here I've highlighted all of those prefixes "mis" because I think there's an interesting parallel here to make with all the different shades of information that we now see in everyday life, particularly if we're thinking about the COVID pandemic and so-called fake news and the different ways of categorizing that now. We differentiate between misinformation, that information that's shared, but not with the desire to mislead, to detract from true information, and misinformation being different to disinformation, where there is that very much agenda behind the sharing of that information. So this comes back to this idea that the neuromyth is something that we might well use, but with the best intentions, both to improve our teaching and learning through our understanding of the brain, as well as the understanding and learning of those whom we support. So let's think about some neuromyths then. And what I've done here is I've taken 3 examples, and the first one is this, which we'll have a go at reviewing through some polls. So first neuromyth is this: intelligence is fixed, not fluid. So we'll just give a moment to launch the poll here. Super, thank you so much. And to nod to Gabriella and Savitri, who are superbly as ever in the background. Okay. I think nearly everyone has answered, which is great. Okay, so I'll keep the details of that quiet for now. For now, let's move on to our next poll. So let me go to the next slide. Okay. Let's see if I can make sure we go forward. No, still going backwards. Okay. Let's see what's going on here. Okay. Forwards we go. Super. Right. Second neuromyth. Or is it? Some people are more right-brained and others are more left-brained. This is a really interesting one. Different responses from the others. Okay. A couple more moments for anyone who hasn't responded as yet. This is very interesting. Very interesting. Superb. Okay, I think we've got effectively. Yes. Okay. Someone else has just jumped in. Excellent. Okay, superb. Again, I'll keep this one quiet for now, and we will see how we do heading along to the next one. Let's see. Okay. Excellent. Right. Spot the neuromyth or not. Number 3. Individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning styles. Let's see how we get on with a poll with this one. Superb. Okay, right. Now for a moment of revealing. So let's see again if we can make progress by going forward. I see what happens here. Okay. So thank you everyone who took part in those. So now to reveal some of the answers. So, Neuromyth 1. Intelligence is fixed, not fluid. In fact, this is a neuromyth, a false idea about the brain. And here we had, really interestingly, in terms of the polls, we had about, well, nearly 9/10 of everyone here saying it was false, and we had someone who thought it was true. And I think already what we see when we're going through these examples is just how sticky a good story is. Excellent. Okay, so that's our first one. Intelligence is fixed, not fluid. And here, thank you. I think Gabrielle is kindly letting me share some results. Okay. So intelligence is fixed and not fluid. And this is actually categorized as a myth about intelligence. This comes through to this discussion about nature versus nurture, which is so prominent in a lot of cultures and in a lot of teaching circles. This a sense that you're born and you're a fixed entity in terms of what you're able to do. But actually what research has shown is that, number one, it's really difficult to understand the environmental influences. It is easier to investigate the genetic differences between individuals and understand how their learning capabilities might function and manifest themselves. But actually, so at the moment, this is a neuromyth, but in effect, we don't actually have enough evidence to really understand the environmental factors, because they're hard to judge, and also that nurture debate. But certainly, what we do know is that intelligence is not fixed. On to our second one then, that some people are more right-brained and others are more left-brained. And here, really interestingly, there was more of a split actually. So 6 out of 10 people, forgive me, 6 out of the 8, so we had about 60% thought it was true, and then about 40%, 3 of us thought it was false. And again, I think this one is a very sticky story, something that is disseminated in lots of education circles to try and explain the fact that some of our students seem to be more creative or more scientific. And we'll come on to some of the dangers of that in a moment. So here are the results for poll 2. And this, if I can hopefully progress without going backwards, if Canva is going to allow me to. Superb. Right. This is a myth about brain architecture and structure. So in fact, what we know is that, yes, there's 2 hemispheres of the brain, but they work together, they function together in a whole set of activities. And oftentimes both sides are fired up. And to think about the origins of this myth story, often it is rooted in something that we can observe easily. So in this case, it's the sense that there's a huge proportion of people who are right-handed and some people are left-handed, and people are looking to match that up. And as we know from studies of human evolution, we like patterns. It helps us make sense of the world around us. So this one makes sense. There's logic in it. And that's one of the challenges of the neuromyth, is that there is logic behind it. So over to our third one then. Individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning styles. This one was really interesting because I think this one, if we come, yes, back to the poll results, most of us believe that this is true. And again, I think this neuromyth is the one that I see most predominantly across education circles, across geographies, across contexts. And I've seen it quite a bit talked about in the forum for this initiative as well. And this is why I picked upon this one. And where does it come from? It comes from some very convincing writing about the idea that we are either visual learners or auditory learners or kinesthetic learners. And again, it gives us a clear idea of patterns and helps us in that sense making. But again, this is as much a neuromyth because we just don't know. We don't have the evidence, but what we do know is that we actually need all of our senses to learn. So in this sense, this is a neuromyth that we can really, I guess, broadly categorize as a myth about teaching and learning. So 3 neuromyths that are just really one of so many that have been brought to the forefront by Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa. And it's 3 of 68. Now, 68 is quite a number, and this is even greater than the 44 neuromyths she identified in her work in 2016. So on the one hand, we've got greater access to information, we've got greater ability to share information across forums such as this, and fora such as the social media platforms, but we have to almost be even more on our toes and aware that there's a lot of misinformation, especially in the education world. And this is down to oftentimes this material not being brought into teacher training. And this is why we're talking about it today. So much for the theory, but what about the practice? Let's take a moment now. I'm just looking at our numbers. There's 11 of us. So I guess in fact, we can go, perhaps we can do pairs and then reassign, do 1, 3, and take a moment to reflect on these 3, what we have now identified as neuromyths. Intelligence is fixed, not fluid, a myth about intelligence. The myth that some people are more right-brained and others are more left-brained, a myth about brain architecture and structure. And our 3rd one, individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning styles, a myth about teaching and learning. And think about what the danger is of perpetuating these myths. How can they impact adversely our teaching and learning? So we'll just get organized, take some time in the breakout rooms. I'll hop in and out also, and then we'll bring everyone back and discuss further. Gradually. No problem if any, I know a few people have got really busy schedules, so anyone who needs to hop out and attend to other parts of their day, that's no problem. And as ever, we will set up the recording as soon as possible and all the slides so everyone can catch up. Thank you so much to those who've newly joined. I know there's a few people who've joined a little bit part way. Anyone who didn't have the opportunity to hop into a breakout room, we were just discussing neuromyths and also exchanging a little bit more on myths in our culture. Thank you so much, Gloria and June. I had the privilege to speak to June in Jamaica and Gloria in Nigeria, and we were just discussing the prevalence of myths around us. So I now know not to sweep out my house because that's bad luck. So I definitely won't be doing that anytime soon. And also discussing the danger of these myths. We identified a few themes. I'd love to invite anyone else in from the other rooms to discuss and share what was discussed about the impact of the myths on teaching and learning. So if anyone would like to raise a hand or unmute yourselves, I'd love to hear what happened in other rooms. If anyone would like to. Otherwise, I can dive straight into. So some of the ideas that we were talking about, I guess, it's all about pigeonholing. And if you categorize as someone with a fixed set of intelligence, who's someone who's creative or not creative, someone who learns in a better style, effectively you're stunting possibilities. You're removing the opportunity to explore new disciplines, the opportunity to explore different ways of learning. So to think about the dangers then, I guess, individually, we can even label these. This idea that intelligence is fixed and not fluid. We're really encouraging what we saw last week with Carol Dweck, the danger of a fixed mindset. The idea that if you can't learn, then why would you bother? So that's a really, really dangerous one. The second one, again, this danger of fixed ability, it takes away this a very important concept of neuroplasticity, which we're learning more and more about, both in terms of early years, but just referring to the other reading for this week, later years, and even having to relearn as a form of rehabilitation or at moments of cognitive decline. And finally, this idea that you receive information in preferred learning styles, a pigeonholing and a danger of halting learning. To come back then to Takahama Espinosa and this, what the neuromyth does, and also why the neuromyth persists. So we were talking quite extensively about how sticky the learning style myth is. And this is what she says: insufficient information can lead to logical but erroneous hypotheses, which are generally corrected over time thanks to advances in technology that allow us to see more than meets the eye. And I think, as we identified with the myths you shared from around the world, that a lot of the myths that we grow up in cultures are things that we can observe individually. Now, as we know, science, or we hope science, doesn't stand still, that there's a forward movement. And it brings us back to this idea of truth being really what we know if we've got the evidence to show it. We've talked a lot about neuromyths, but that isn't to say that all ideas are wrong. As Tracy highlights in Neuromyths, not all ideas are wrong. And one of the ideas that has proved over a long time, or indeed hasn't been disproved, is Aristotle's notion that we learn through different senses. And this is where it comes back to the learning styles neuromyth, this idea that you only learn through one sense. In fact, we all need different senses, but it might be that different senses come and have particular importance or prominence. And again, that was something we were discussing in our breakout room, that a myth generally isn't something that can be completely shown to be false, but will have a grain of truth in it, hence its stickiness, hence why it gets disseminated, hence why it gets believed and handed down through generations. So we're a good 45 minutes in to our session today. To highlight what we're going to come on to for anyone who needs to drop off the call and perhaps catch up later. The first aim of today was really to underline why we need to revisit learning. And by taking that time to go through the neuromyths, I really wanted to focus on the urgency of revisiting some ideas and the urgency for all of us to keep revisiting learning as science evolves and the work of learning scientists is put forward with authoritative evidence. There's also a moment to critique how we've all learnt and teach in light of neuromyths and week 3 reading, which is what we'll come on to. And by the time we part ways today, I'd like to have introduced our week 4 topic and material, and importantly flagged our special guest session, which will happen tomorrow. We've got a huge privilege to have Dr. John Cook join us. And I'm just going to put the link in the chat here. And that bit.ly link should take you straight to the registration page to register for tomorrow, which will take place at 9 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, 9 p.m. UTC. So a little bit later in the day, as John will be joining us from down under, down in Australia. Some fascinating work. Again, we will record. If you would like to join us live, you'd be extremely welcome. So to come back then to how we learn with the evidence of how we learn, we looked at a documentary from Olav Shoei this week, a half-an-hour documentary talking about Spanish learning and how to learn a language very quickly, or at least as quickly or as efficiently as possible. So I don't know if anyone would like to share some of the strategies, perhaps as a way of practicing some of the advice that he was giving. If anyone would like to pop in the chat any of the strategies that Olav shared. And it might be that some of these were known to you already, or possibly were completely new. I'll keep an eye on the chat, or for anyone to sort of reflect on that documentary if you were able to watch it or dip into it. It might also be a moment to think about how you would go about learning a language. And I think that's one of the great interests of this documentary, is that it takes some of the strategies that many of us might have already used in learning a second language, but gives some of the evidence behind it. So I'm keeping an eye out. What I'll do is put everyone out of misery, as it were, by coming straight ahead then to identify some of the strategies that Olav shared. So throughout the course of the, oh, perfect, Pearl, thank you so much. Exercise regularly, yeah, absolutely, a really important one. And indeed, that's the fourth strategy that he shares. He starts out and he suggests speak and listen as much as possible. Now, if we were to extrapolate what that means in a broader learning setting, what we're actually talking about is active learning. So practicing what you want to get good at. The second is use real life situations. And I guess here we're talking about making everything as relevant as possible. Then to space out your learning. And this is a piece of advice, I think, that's really gathered pace and does indeed feature in lots of education contexts. The importance of interleaving your learning, spaced repetition. You learn best when you keep revisiting material, just like we've been revisiting learning. Exercise, very important, and Olav actually goes through why exercise is important in terms of building those long-term memories, the release of a neurotransmitter, a hormone that helps us build memories. Also talks about novel spatial environments, not listed as one of his strategies, but talks about how refreshing it is for the mind and the working and long-term memory to take ourselves to new spaces and even to attempt to undertake that learning in new spaces. Then there's the point of challenging yourself, but not too much. So really scaffolding. We're not going to be solving complex equations at age 4. We're probably going to need to have a run up with algebra and all of that. Those mastery building blocks that Khan Academy does so proficiently and powerfully with its scheme and video learning. Take frequent breaks and get enough sleep, again, for that building of memory. And finally, we get to that key element that we're always looking to explore, which is this motivation question. And how do you create an inner drive? Some relevance as we look back to the other strategies, which is where does that motivation come from? Well, if we're not so tired, so we've had enough sleep, had breaks, had exercise, we're feeling healthy. If there's a relevance, so we feel that it's got a role, there's importance for it. But that really coming to the center really of all learning is motivation. If we're not motivated, it won't happen. And reflecting back on our neuromyths, if we believe we don't have the right intelligence to do something, that we're either a right or left brain, or we only learn in a certain way, then motivation becomes all the harder. So taking these strategies, I'd love to take a moment to go into the co-creation resource that we've all been building together this week. We'll put the link in the chat so that you can navigate to the Google Doc before we go into the breakout room, so you've got access to it. As you can see, it's been really populated this week, which is superb. So lots of sharing of experiences of how people have learnt, and also how people have taught as well. Some really interesting themes and nuggets of advice and pointers that link us back to the strategies that Olav shares with us. So what I'd encourage you is, through looking at the Google Slides, if you can get access to them, once you're in your breakout rooms, to go through this 4-stage cycle that we've been talking about, the critical and creative cycle, this reflecting, connecting, critiquing and creating cycle, and read through what's been shared in relation to teaching and learning. And think about how the points raised by you reflect what Olav Showe and Barbara Oakley discuss. So we have 10 minutes to take some time to go into that co-creation resource and go through that critical and creative cycle, and then come back and share. So let's welcome back, everyone. I think we're nearly a full house of everyone coming back. A lot of it, I realised quite how much information there was to work through in a very short space of time. But I was very keen for us to at least touch upon the co-creation resource. And of course, it's going to be up there and available. Oh, I can see we've got a few people are just coming back in. So I think, right, I think we're now, yes. We've got another couple of seconds, so I'll just hold off before and make sure that everyone's here. Superb. So I was just saying to those who joined back to the main room, a lot of information to work through, and a very rich resource. So thank you to those who've already contributed to it. This will stay open for the next couple of weeks. So it's a resource for you to come back to and to dig into. And really, it's another way of structuring a sharing of expertise and experience. And what I'll do is I'll put these questions at the top of this resource so that it's an opportunity to revisit and ask some of these questions of it again. For me, as I was looking through and thinking about what is there that's happening in all of your teaching practice that is extremely valuable in terms of highlighting these strategies that are already happening, there was some certain themes that came out for me. There was a lot about revisiting material, about making it relevant and important and applicable by understanding and applying material to real life situations. The moment where I shared how I learned was actually a reflection on my part to say how I feel I learned ineffectively, which was often when I was younger, was thinking just drilling is the way just to remember something. And what we now know from the learning sciences is that to really embed something in memory, it needs to be meaningful. So understanding and having that relevance is really, really important. Some colleagues focused on acronyms and memory techniques. Again, that's a way of creating meaning in a different way. Visual metaphors is something that Professor Barbara Oakley talks a lot about, the power of the metaphor. I think just to pluck an example out of the air, I was working with some students recently and I couldn't remember how to pronounce the name of one of my students. Her name was spelt T-E-G-A-N, so it could have been Tegan or Tegan. And I said to her, right, when I think of you, I'm going to think about a pot of tea, which she laughed at, but now every time I think of her, I can remember. So that's just a simple, funny way. There, of course, I remember her for other reasons than pots of tea. But it's amazing how once you think of something pictorially without thinking that you're only a visual learner, it has real impact in what you remember. I really loved the moment also in this resource when someone was talking about moving away from chalk and talk, getting students to be participants in their learning. And as we know, and I guess what we've been circling around about today is about metacognition, knowing about understanding, and helping our students do that. Looking to games for engagement, encouraging the why, criticality is something else that colleagues commented on, and the power of drill. An area that is quite controversial, especially in the UK at the minute. The idea that you drill information is a bit unfashionable, but has this these two camps, because we know that in order to be creative about a topic or a discipline, we need to have a knowledge base embedded. So drill, something that is encountering, I guess, a level of controversy certainly here. And then to end, I guess, with this creative streak is this idea of STEAM, bringing the arts into all of your other subjects, and STEAM being a way of encapsulating that idea, bringing the arts into STEM subjects. And I guess this discussion about what teaching and learning is, how we teach and learn, and how we shouldn't teach and learn because of neuromyths, brings us back yet again to these SDGs. And of course, our key SDG that we're all concerned with, which is quality education. If we are going to deliver on quality education, as we were discussing last week in relation to education heroes, we need to know what education should or could look like if we build on the evidence. And I hope that the moment of talking through a couple of neuromyths today has really helped to engender that revisiting of learning, rethinking, and I guess expanding on what we think about as quality education, not just education as we've always known it, but education as it could possibly be. So with this in mind, this leads us very nicely into our final topic already, which is education, hopes and ambitions. As ever, what we've done here is pick up on some readings, which at this point I've picked a couple of pieces that I've produced throughout my work over the years. A blog post talking about 21st century soft skills. So we come back to this notion of terminology and its utility in education, and also this idea of Kaizen, which you might have heard in relation to corporate structures, and this idea from Japanese business that every day you can get a little bit better. And it's a term that I've been reflecting on in relation to what we could call slow education. There's a whole number of slow movements going around the world, slow food in reaction to fast food, slow media to help us slow down how we're consuming information and putting out information into the ether. Less talked about is this idea of slow education, which I'm very interested in and have started exploring in my thinking and writing. So a snippet here that I recorded for another project, but might be a nice way of leading us into this subject. As ever, we've got our 4 topics: reflect, connect, critique, and create, our framework rather, to lead us through this. We also have, as well as the other 3 co-creation resources, we have another co-creation resource, and this one acts very much like the one that we've had to date in terms of sticky notes and an opportunity. You're invited to share your education hopes and ambitions. And this will be a really useful exercise, I hope, that will lead you into the assessment that we will talk more about next week, and I'll just touch upon in a moment. But for now, I'd like us to take stock of this week and also look ahead to the final weeks or so through the words of encouragement of Savitri, who's kindly recorded this. So just give me a moment.
Congratulations on completing the 3rd week of the Digital Teaching and Learning, the pre-edit course. As we prepare to progress to week 4, let us summarize the activities covered in week 3. We looked at the topic Learning Revisited, and some of you shared your insights into Olaf's techniques, describing them as impressive. Furthermore, the techniques suggested by Olaf resonated with you as you saw the importance of knowing the different learning styles and learning processes, while at the same time reflecting upon how you learned and how you teach. There were not many reflections on Barbara Oakley's LinkedIn posts. However, we want to encourage you to take a dive and look into this very powerful and uplifting video that really makes us consider the power of lifelong learning. At present, we are all in the early stages of our educational journeys. But think about as we or even our loved ones grow older and face cognitive decline, how significant it is to understand the lifelong process of learning in our lives and that of society at large. Some general discussions from the forum: online learning versus data protection. Digital teaching and learning encourages us to use various platforms and learning management systems. How can we ensure that data is protected? The need for cybersecurity came up again. Assessment was also mentioned. Some ways to conduct testing digitally and reducing incidences of cheating are: allow for only taking the test once, change the test question sequence, prohibit backtracking, set up the exam to show one question at a time, have a designated testing slot for each course, have every student start the exam around the same time, and limit how long each student will have to take the exam. One participant mentioned the importance of integrity. The system of education offered should be able to promote good morals among students. The importance of sharing ideas. Knowledge is expanded. It helps to create open communication. We can learn from others who can share their insightful experiences with us. Our session 3 workshop, our educational journey took us even deeper as we discussed in our breakout rooms the terms coined by Carol Dweck, growth and fixed mindset, as they relate to our own teaching and learning practices. We reflected on how a growth mindset can lead us to make positive changes in our lives and that of our learners. As we head into week 4, we encourage you to keep the forums alive with your participation. We applaud all efforts thus far and look forward to more engagement in the coming week. Best wishes from the DTL pre-edit team. Thank you.
Superb. Savitri, thank you so much, Azentha. That was really superb. And now I will come back. I've also, in the meantime, in terms of learning points, I've worked out how not to go backwards on Canva. Always click in the middle of the slide and not at the bottom. So anyone else who uses Canva for presentations, that is my key learning point to share. Savitri, thank you so much. And Gabriella, thank you for jumping in to show that video. So we are at the 4th week of our program. Tomorrow, to highlight the special guest session, we have the huge privilege of being joined by Dr. John Cook, who's the author of book Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, the founder of skepticalscience.com. And Cranky Uncle is this avatar that he's developed through his complementary activities as a cartoonist as well as a climate scientist. The link to register is at the bottom here, bit.ly DTL and we will also send out details as a reminder. An announcement went through the course page over the weekend, just before the weekend, and there's details also on the course page. In terms of whetting appetites for the session, you can head to see a taste of John's work. There's a link here So we'll share that when we share these slides. You can actually try John's Cranky Uncle game. There's a link and a code that enables you to access the game without needing to sign up, which has also been shared on the course page. And what will we be talking about? Well, we'll be having a tete-a-tete, a bit of a fireside discussion, thinking about the convergence of inoculation theory, critical thinking, climate science, and digital tools. And finally, next week, just to look ahead as we start to close up our programme, we'll be having a panel constituting myself and two leaders in the EdTech world, someone from Parlay Ideas over in Canada, someone from a London-based EdTech company. And what I'll be doing is posing questions linked to each of our themes from the past 4 weeks. And this will be very much a journey talking about all the theory, all of the rich discussions we've been having and thinking about how those work in practice. So I hope if you've got time, you'll be able to join us next week. As ever, the session will be recorded and we will share it. And after that session, we will then release the end of course reflection. Those of you who joined us at the beginning of the initiative or looking for the certificate of participation, we did launch this start of course reflection, and completing the start of course and end of course is a prerequisite for achieving a certificate of participation. And finally, over to you. If there's any questions that you would like to ask at this point, we do have a bit of flex in our schedule, so would be very happy to take any questions. We'll hold on in case there are. Or indeed any reflections or sharing on neuromyths that we've encountered today. We'll stick around for the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. Also, just to raise, we will share details next week, but we will really encourage you to share any feedback on what works and what doesn't work so well, so that we can really learn from this format in amongst what's available to us technically, and as we're working out how best to use Zoom and WooClap and all of these other integrations. So really we'd love to learn as much as possible from you how this format works and whether it's useful to do quite so many in-person sessions, and indeed time of year as well, because I really appreciate everyone's very, very busy at this time of year. So we will send out a survey in relation to this. So it'll be really about format, length of time, programming, and that will really help us develop what's most useful for you going forward. We will stay on. I've just got a Gabriella, thank you. Gabriella's just updated me that we've updated the Zoom settings. So fingers crossed, Pearl, hopefully it starts to work for you. If there's any problems, because we do want people to join. We're not trying to block people out, the more the merrier. If there's any issues, please do share a screenshot or a recording of what you're seeing. We'll try and work it out. Superb. Superb. Unless there are any further questions, wish you a really productive day of teaching and learning. Thank you so much for joining today. Really, as I say, we really do appreciate it. It's a very, very busy time of year, and joining in-person sessions is just another thing to fit in the schedule. So I hope that there's been some food for thought. If you're interested in the book, I've got it next to me. As you can see, it's a bit of a Bible. It's a really superb book. I'm not getting any cut from sales, so this isn't a marketing feat as an extra bit of income, but it's really, really excellent. It's very, very neatly set out. It's very digestible, really good for dipping in and out of. And I'd say actually that it's accessible for older students as well. So definitely one to dip in and out of. I'd really recommend it, and is superbly categorized and organized. So an excellent book to have on hand. Without further ado then, in which case I guess we can close the meeting. Thank you so much to everyone again for joining, and hope to see you tomorrow or indeed next week. All the very best.